The headlights were the first warning, two sets of yellow eyes cutting through the thick, greasy fog of a Harlem midnight. They didn't speed, they crawled. 5 men inside a heavy black sedan, their breath fogging up the glass, their hands resting on cold iron. In the back seat, the leader checked his watch, 12:04. The street was a graveyard of brick and shadow. No sirens, no witnesses, just the low, rhythmic hum of the engine and the smell of cheap gasoline. Across the street, in a doorway that seemed to swallow the light, a single cigarette cherry glowed. It didn't move. It didn't flicker with the tremor of a nervous hand. It sat perfectly still. One man, one shadow, against 5 of the most disciplined killers the Bronx had to offer. The sedan door opened with a metallic click that sounded like a bone breaking. One by one, 4 men stepped onto the damp pavement. They moved with the practiced ease of hunters who had done this 100 times. They didn't look at the man in the doorway. They looked at the space around him. They were looking for the army they expected him to have. But there was no army, just the fog, just the silhouette. And then the silence changed. It wasn't the silence of an empty street anymore. It was the silence of a held breath. The 4 hitmen closed the distance, their coats fanning out like wings. They reached the doorway. They reached for the man. And that was when the darkness itself seemed to lunge forward. There was no shouting, no Hollywood gunfire, just the sickening thud of lead hitting soft tissue and the desperate wet gasp of a man who realized too late that he hadn't walked into an ambush, he had walked into a slaughterhouse. 3 minutes later, the sedan was still there, the engine was still humming, but the street was different now. The fog had turned a darker shade of red where it pooled in the gutters. One man, just one, was on his knees by the rear tire. He wasn't reaching for his gun. He was reaching for the door handle with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. He looked back at the doorway. The cigarette was gone. The shadow was gone. But the fear was now the only thing left alive on that block. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books will tell you about the wars between the families. They'll show you the black and white photos of crime scenes on the Lower East Side, but they never told you about the night the Bronx stood still. The police reports from that evening were lost in a fire that nobody could explain. The witnesses were paid in a currency of silence that lasted for 40 years. They wanted the world to believe that the Italian syndicate was the only force in New York that mattered. They were wrong. This story is the missing chapter in the book of American power. It's the story that will change how you understand what happens when an unstoppable force finally meets an immovable man. Before he was the ghost of 116th Street, Ellsworth was a man who knew the cost of every breath he took. He lived in the friction. He was a man of high intellect trapped in a low-bottom world, a poet who had to learn the language of the blade. He felt the weight of Harlem in his bones, the struggle, the pressure of 1 million people trying to breathe through a straw. He spent his nights in the back of libraries reading the strategies of Roman generals while his peers were learning how to sell numbers. There was a war inside him long before there was a war on the streets. He wanted a different life, a quiet life, but the city had other plans. He realized early on that in a world of wolves, you don't find peace by hiding. You find it by becoming the thing the wolves fear most. The name was spoken in the Italian social clubs as a curiosity at first, a problem in the northern part of the city. They didn't see a king, they saw an obstacle. They whispered about him over espresso in East Harlem, laughing at the idea that one man could hold a territory they had spent decades claiming. They didn't see the way the shopkeepers in Harlem looked at him when he walked by. They didn't feel the sudden drop in temperature when he entered a room. Respect in Harlem wasn't earned through loud talk or flashy cars. It was earned in the nods of the old men on the stoops and the way the children stopped playing to watch him pass. It was a power that was felt, not announced. The tension began to ratchet up with every sunset. A shipment of liquor hijacked. A numbers runner slapped around. The syndicate was testing the fences, looking for a weak spot. But every time they pushed, they hit iron. Every time they sent a message, the reply was silence. That silence was the most terrifying thing of all. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that Bumpy wasn't reacting. He was preparing. He was calculating the wind speed, the humidity, and the exact psychological breaking point of men who thought they were gods. This is where everything changed. The decision to send the 5 hitmen wasn't just an assassination attempt, it was a statement of policy. It was meant to be the end of the Harlem experiment. The bosses in the Bronx thought they were sending a message that would resonate across all 5 boroughs. That decision would haunt the families for 3 generations. No section of the city felt safe after that night. The hunters realized that for the first time in history, they were the ones being tracked. As the night of the hit approached, the pacing of life in Harlem slowed to a crawl. The street performers packed up early. The jazz clubs felt a little more hollow, the music a little sharper. Bumpy spent those final hours alone. He didn't call for reinforcements. He didn't hide in a bunker. He stood in the center of the storm, feeling the air change. He knew exactly which car would come. He knew exactly which men would be inside. He had mapped out their fears before they had even loaded their weapons. He delayed his move on purpose, letting the hitmen stew in the silence of the Harlem streets, letting their confidence turn into a subtle, itching doubt. The reveal was not a spectacle of fire and noise. It was a surgical strike in the dark. The 4 hitmen didn't fall to a hail of bullets. They fell to a man who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. It was psychological. It was intimate. One by one, their reality was dismantled. The 5th man, the one in the car, didn't stay because he was brave. He stayed because he was paralyzed. He watched through the windshield as his world evaporated in the fog. He saw Bumpy emerge from the shadows, not as a killer, but as an inevitability. Bumpy didn't finish him. He didn't have to. He leaned over the hood of the car and looked the survivor in the eye, a look so cold it felt like a winter that would never end. The survivor didn't drive back. He crawled. He abandoned the car 3 blocks away and spent the night hiding in alleys, a broken shell of a man who had seen the face of a god he didn't believe in. When he finally made it back to the Bronx, he didn't bring a message of victory. He brought a plague of fear. The word spread through the syndicate like a virus. The rules had permanently changed. Harlem was no longer a territory to be taken. It was a sovereign nation with a ruler who didn't play by their rules. The moment became a legend that grew with every telling. It wasn't just about 5 hitmen. It was about the night the myth of the Mafia's invincibility died in a Harlem doorway. It was the night Bumpy Johnson became the ghost that kept the bosses awake at night. Power is not about how many men you can command. It is about how much of the world you can control with just your presence. It is a game of foresight, of knowing the end before the beginning has even started. Control is the ability to let your enemies think they are winning right up until the moment they realize they've already lost. The final line of the story wasn't written in blood, but in the memory of the one man who made it back. He never spoke another word for the rest of his life. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.